I'm not saying it's a probable cause standard, but as you hear Jerry Nadler talk about looking into possible impeachment, do you see enough in the record from what we know right now to suggest there is reason to believe that perhaps President Trump could be impeached?
I think so. You're right. It's not a probable cause standard, but it's ultimately a standard that's left up to Congress. And here you've got a situation where we know there was a meeting with Russians in Trump Tower. We know that there was some effort, at least by all appearances, and at least the evidence in the public record at this point, to cover up that meeting by Little Don and maybe by Trump. We don't know that yet. We know about a continued business operation and realize that a lot of this could be resolved if we just had the tax returns. And the president has played this game now for several years and refused to give that information. So now that the Democrats have control of the House and of these committees, it's the natural tendency to move toward a place where they can find out what was going on with the Trump business. And I think at the end of the day, this is going to be a case, and I think you'll see this at the end of Bob Mueller's investigation, this is going to be a case about following the money. And maybe Jerry Nadler, since he's taken over chairmanship of the committee, is also looking at that and about following the money and whether or not, in fact, there will be Russian money that was run through the Trump business organization that may have been then played into some decisions that the president made, whether it was about sanctions or otherwise. Those things can lead to allegations of collusion, conspiracy. There's really no collusion in the federal law, but conspiracy, cover-ups, obstruction. Why was the investigation halted? Why was Comey fired? Those questions may be answered as we move forward.
So Jeffrey, how about for you? I'm going to quote here from Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and he said over the weekend, "We do not now have the evidence all sorted out and everything to do an impeachment. Before you impeach somebody, you have to persuade the American public that it ought to happen." But we just heard, actually, from Michael that it's better off to start with the tax returns. Why didn't they start with a rifle rather than a shotgun?
And Michael's right. I mean, you do want to follow the money. And I think what Representative Nadler is doing, as well as the other committees, as they bring in testimony, really, it's a lot of pent-up energy because Congress hasn't really been doing their oversight job for years. And now we see it happening. And we see a little bit of a snippet of a courtroom happening in the last interrogation, really, of Michael Cohen, where he brought forth some documents. And that is what a prosecutor would bring forth. So you do see some of it. And what Nadler's doing is he's trying to get his arms around it, as are the other committees. There is so much. Some of it is just atmospherics. Some of it, there might not be any material there. And some of it, it looks like there are some evidence. There is some material that can be reviewed. So I don't think it's not scattershot at all. They're trying to pick the one or two or perhaps three items that might bear the most fruit. And certainly interactions with Russia. And there's a lot of things under that umbrella. It's the meeting, it's decisions that Mr. Trump has made, and it is certainly money that Mr. Trump may owe. And tax returns are going to answer that. Anything a real estate developer would do is certainly deduct the interest on loans, and so that's in one of the schedules. And I think that would reveal a lot.
So Jeffrey, just to stay with you for a moment, we haven't heard from Mr. Mueller yet. And frankly, we won't hear, the Attorney General here. And the question is, what gets done with that report and the information behind it? As a practical matter, is there any chance that all that information will not ultimately end up in the hands of the House Judiciary Committee for Jeffrey?
There's a possibility. It goes right now. Once the DAG leaves, the new Attorney General will take over the investigation. So Mueller will give it to AG Barr. AG Barr then has a lot of options. He can give a summary. He can turn the whole thing over with some redactions, perhaps for ongoing investigations and national security. So we're going to get not necessarily a snippet, but not the whole picture. Then it behooves Congress, perhaps, to call in Mr. Mueller and ask him some questions. So there's a couple lives to this. The American public is certainly not going to know everything Mr. Mueller knows the first blush.
So Michael, what about the claim of privilege? Because that's at least being talked about right now, that the White House, for good and sufficient reason, is going to want to say what's in this report, because some of it may be privileged. At the same time, going all the way back to President Nixon, United States versus Nixon, that privilege is maybe a little narrower than we think it is, right, Michael?
That's right. You know, the executive privilege is meant to allow a president to have communications, to do planning, that type of thing. It's not meant to be a shield to cover up criminal conduct. And so this reliance on the privilege, to me, has been misplaced by the administration. You know, one place we look, and if you just look at last week's testimony about Michael Cohen, one of the most damning things that came out, in my opinion, was the fact that the president's lawyers had reviewed the testimony that he gave to Congress, which was now considered to be perjured. If, in fact, that is true, then you've got significant problems with the White House legal team, maybe not with White House counsel, but maybe with the president's personal lawyers. If they let that go out, if, in fact, they pushed perjured testimony or allowed testimony or guided testimony in a way that misled or lied to Congress, as Michael Cohen has now pled guilty to, then I don't think those guys are going to be able to even find a job doing title records for the cemetery in Ludowici, Georgia. I mean, this is going to be just a complete disaster for the president's legal team. It's also going to affect his privilege argument. So there are a lot of moving parts in this thing. I think that we're going to have significant developments now that we have a change, and that was a major, major shift when the Democrats took over the House committees. I just think at this point, the doors are beginning to open. We hear about Mueller closing his investigation or wrapping up his investigation. People have been saying that now for months and months and months. That may be true, but I think that even if the Attorney General, as my colleague has sort of indicated, if the Attorney General decides that the regulations require him to keep the report or parts of the report very secret, and there's some validity to that, you don't want to have innocent people berated around in front of the public. But if some of that report's kept quiet, then you're likely to see committees, oversight committees, judiciary committees move forward and bring the information to the forefront.
Michael, you make a very important point that I think we overlook, which is we tend to focus on, is there going to be some proceeding against the President of the United States? There are a lot of other people around the President of the United States that even if it is the case that you can't indict a sitting president, not a resolved question, but there's some suggestion that even if that's true, there are all sorts of other people that could be indicted.
That's exactly right. There are a lot of people around the president. There are people in his family, his inner circle. We've already seen a number of people charged. But let me also suggest to you that there's a possibility perhaps of an indictment against the president's business, against the Trump organization. We know, in fact, that Mueller's not opposed to that. He's done that with the Russian company, as we've had this long indictment of people involved in that. He could bring that in. He could do a RICO case. He could talk about conspiracy in that case. While he would not be then violating the Department of Justice's guidance about indicting a sitting president, he would be bringing in and pointing a very sharp finger at the president for his conduct during the operation of that business. And again, that's going to be talking about where the money went, who it came from, what debts were owed, what promises perhaps were made in exchange for getting that financing. And so this is going to be an interesting tale as we move forward. So we may not have the president indicted, but I certainly think you've got his son is in serious jeopardy. His son-in-law, I suggest to you, is in serious jeopardy, and perhaps his business.
Jeffrey, to take the other side of this just for a moment, that is to say, assume that there isn't enough to indict the president or proceed on impeachment. How do you feel as a former prosecutor about the notion of a prosecutor saying, I'm not going to indict, I'm not going to proceed, but here's all the bad news about them? Because as you know, historically, that's not been the way it works. You're not going to indict, you just walk away from it. At the same time, Jim Comey really sort of opened that up a little bit. And maybe the Republicans up on the Hill opened up even more in the investigation of Hillary Clinton. How do you feel as a matter of prosecutorial discretion about revealing information if you're not going to indict?
You're right, and that's the kind of the juxtaposition here, if you will. If an average citizen charges are brought but not indicted, the public doesn't hear about that, and appropriately so, because charges weren't brought. With the President of the United States, it's not shocking to say that's a different animal. And I can't imagine anyone wouldn't want to know if the President of the United States owes a couple $100 million to a Russian oligarch. Who wouldn't want to know that? I think the American public has a right to know that. So here we're kind of in the gray zone where the most powerful man in the world, while not indicted, certainly has some things about him that may suggest split loyalties. I think it's appropriate that get a public airing, and that is in direct contrast to a normal case. This is not a normal case by any definition.